ورعهم بعينك التي لا تنام. اللهم احسب كل من مات منهم في عداد الشهداء. اللهم لا تحرمنا أجرهم ولا تفتنا بعدهم واغفر لنا ولهم. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. Can I get two of the guys running around the back? Come up here. I have a job for you. Yep, gray and green, come on over. Bismillah. Chop, chop. Don't worry, you're not in trouble. You're not in trouble. Yeah, both of you guys. Let's go. Bismillah. I have a job for you. What's your name? Adam, what's your name? Ali, what's your name? Blue. Get up. Bismillah. What's your name? Adam Mustafa. Okay. So your job is to pass this out in celebration, inshallah, for Gaza, around the brothers in the masjid. Make sure everyone only gets one. I'm kidding. No. Give them as many as they want. And then you guys get to keep it at the end. Okay? Equal distribution of ghanaim. Okay? Yalla, bismillah. Start on the right and go around the masjid. Okay, bismillah. Good job. So, wallahi, there's too much to talk about tonight. Too much to talk about. So, just as a quick reminder, I mean, alhamdulillah, the turn that the ummah is taking in general, inshallah, it's for the better. And the signs, wallahi, we have on the horizon are very positive. We are an ummah of optimism. We're not an ummah of pessimism. And the event, very rapid events, just over the last 2 months, you know, starting off with, mashallah, the liberation of Syria, the departure of the dictator, and now the new group that's taken over, and now, alhamdulillah, with the ceasefire in Gaza, is all, mashallah, positive for the ummah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide this ummah, give us nasr, and give us liberation. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. So, you know, we can talk about lessons, but the lessons will probably take too long. But you can see, subhanallah, that, you know, the thing I keep saying is when we see these events around us, we have to put on a Quran filter. When we see California fires or hurricanes here, or this going on in Europe, or this person taking over, or, you know, victory in Gaza, or this going on, we have to put a Quran. It's not just the casual, oh yeah, we're just, you know, reading the news like everyone else. And very quickly in the khutbah the other day, I talked about Talut and Jalut. Probably the most important thing with Talut and Jalut is dua in Surah Al-Baqarah relative to this event, relative to the event of Talut and Jalut. And what is it? Allahumma أفرغ علينا صبرا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. So when you had a small group, you know, led by Talut, this is basically the David and Goliath story. So the Christians call it David and Goliath. We have the same story in the Quran al-Kareem, and the massive army of a group called Al-Amaliq, which were a tribe of kuffar. That's for me. Is that a dark chocolate? Because I can't see colors now. I'm kidding. That's okay. So you know, the Amaliq are now fighting off against the Muslims of the time, and we align ourselves with the Muslims of the time, irrespective of the label that you put on. These are generations after Musa alayhi salam, led by Talut. And within the army of Talut is a young man called Dawood alayhi salam, who later on becomes a king and a messenger. He's not a king or a messenger. And he happens to be the one that they put out. He's the one that volunteers to go out in front of Jalut, in English Goliath. And Jalut was a massive, humongous man. Like, again, you look at the odds, not just of the numbers of the armies, the huge army of Kufr versus a small army of Muslims, but the subset of that is Jalut showing up with all his weaponry and decked out in armor and very strong man in front of a young man, right? Young man who's Dawood at the time. And Dawood alayhi salam, the weapon, you know, if you read the books of Tafsir, if you read Bidayah al-Nihaya or Ibn Kathir or any of those, they have a lot of details, you know, and some of them could be true, some of them may not be true. But they actually say that the Muslim side tried to equip Dawood alayhi salam to say, hey, put this on, take this big shield. He's like, I can't use any of this stuff. I can't even carry the stuff you're giving me. All I have with me is my nibla. This, you know, what's it called again in English? A slingshot. All I have is a slingshot. And the Muslims make the dua of Allahumma afrigh alayna sabran wa thabbit aqdamana wa ansurna al qawm al kafirin. Ya Allah, cover us in your sabr and make our feet firm. Meaning, have us be able to stand up to them irrespective of how many they are or how they've come equipped. Wa ansurna ala al qawm al kafirin. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says after that, Dawood kills Jalut. Dawood kills Jalut, which is the completely unexpected thing to have happened. Given the odds, given the circumstances, given the size of the armies, given the size of Dawood versus the size of Jalut. A lot of the Mufassirin, does anyone know what the Mufassirin say about how he killed him? He basically flings his slingshot and it hits him squarely in the face. This is what the Mufassirin say. Allah, hits him squarely in the face. So this massive man, we all have points of pressure. If you ever, anyone keep asking this question, anyone here do martial arts, like, especially like Aikido, like, I don't know what you guys do. Like, you don't watch football, you don't do martial arts. Like, so when you do martial arts, especially ones that have like Aikido and Judo, where you grab people, it teaches you the pressure points. Like if you do here, it hurts here. If you do this to the wrist, like a lot of the, some of the facilities say this is a section of the face that has all. Doesn't matter how big or strong you are, you're still going to get hurt. It's a very weak spot, and it has a lot of nerves in it, and that is how Talut ends up being defeated by Jalut. So again, we see these events happening around us, and we see the reflections of the Quran. The Prophet ﷺ says, there will be a part of my ummah, ala al-haqqi, they will be firm on the truth. They will be firm on the truth. لا يضرهم من خذلهم. Look at the words of the Prophet ﷺ. He says they will not, by the way, this hadith is manifested in 2 or 3 different ways. He says they will not be hurt. There will be a group of my ummah that will be firm on the truth. And even the ones that betray them will not hurt them. Who's going to betray them? The people around them. The people around. Who are supposed to be the most helpful? The people around. Who am I supposed to help the most in trouble? My neighbor. My neighbor. If my neighbor's in trouble, they should reach out to me, and I should be first on the line. Not the one in a different zip code. This is the same thing. So the neighbors will let them down. The neighbors will not let in food, they'll not let in water, etc., etc. So even the neighbors will let them down. But that will not hurt them. That will not hurt them. حتى يأتي أمر الله, until the victory of Allah will manifest itself. The other version of this, and then the Sahaba, the hadith Abu Darda, they asked the Prophet ﷺ, they say, where are they, Ya Rasulullah? We want to be with these people. I know that the Prophet ﷺ say, ببيت المقدس وأكناف بيت المقدس. In Bayt al-Maqdis and the surrounding area of Bayt al-Maqdis. In another hadith, it's the exact same narration, except the Prophet ﷺ adds a thing. He says, the ones that betray them will not hurt them, except for their enemies will kill from them people. And the Prophet ﷺ says, this is normal. That's what you expect. Kill the civilians, that's a normal thing to have happen. In the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them victory and have them stand firm. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Wallahi, today you see, I don't know how many people follow this news, look on Al Jazeera or Arabi or whatever, and they'll show you the live pictures of the prisoners being released and how they're being welcomed by their families. And the Israeli army doesn't want their families to celebrate, and they put out all these conditions. If they celebrate, they're going to block them up again. And literally, it's a crazy thing. So let's move on to tonight, inshallah. We're still in the 8th year of the Hijrah. And tonight we're going to be talking about, inshallah, if we have time, we'll be talking about a Sariyah called Sariyah Dhat al-Salasil. Now, remember last time, or the time before, I can't remember, we were talking about Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu. There was a battle called the Battle of Dhat al-Salasil, would say the first major victory between the Muslims and the Persians was called the Battle of Dhat al-Salasil, the Battle of the Chains, because when the Persian army showed up, this is like in modern day Kuwait area, right in the deep south of Iraq, they tied their men with armor. They tied the men with chains. And this was a technique that the Persians used, and they used it for 2 reasons. They used it for fighting against the light cavalry. So if you charge with the horses and you have these chains, the horses fall over. That's one technique. The second technique is to show the other side that they're never going to retreat. By the way, this wasn't the first time they did it. They did this against the Romans as well. This notion of tying up the men in chains, or the fighting men in chains, was a sign that we're never going to surrender. In other words, we're not retreating from the battle. Part of it was a psychological effect against the other side, right? So that's a battle of Khalid ibn Walid. We covered some of it. We're not going to cover it tonight. But this particular event happened at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's called Sariyat Dhat al-Salasil, and it's the next major milestone in the books of Sirah, right after Mu'tah. So you have Mu'tah, where Khalid bin Walid and the companions are sent up to, effectively what is today modern day Jordan. This is where Mu'tah occurs, deep in enemy territory, as we call it today, right? And the Muslims effectively come back, and they have defeated all the signs of a potential Roman victory. And remember, this wasn't directly against the Romans. This was against, a group of people called the Ghasasina, or the Ghassanid Empire. And the Prophet ﷺ sent them because they had killed his messenger before. And so he sends them. And, the Ghasasina are then backed up by the Romans themselves. In fact, the Roman Emperor Heraclius, who remember a couple of episodes ago said he got the letter of the Prophet ﷺ. When the Ghasasina called for help from the Romans, they're like, hey, we've got these crazy Arabs, man, they're fighting us. We don't know what the heck they're doing here. We're kind of a little bit afraid. He's like, I'll back you up. I'll send you the weapons. I'll send you the army, just like it happens today. Just like it happens today, right? And so the Romans send a massive backup of 20,000 men, armed to the teeth, latest equipment, etc. And the leader that Heraclius sends is his own brother. So the brother of Heraclius is actually there in Mu'tah. He's not the primary commander on the front line, but he's observing from behind. And so when they don't win and they don't achieve their objectives, he goes back to the elder brother and he's like, hey, these guys are hard to fight, man. I just want to tell you, I saw what happened. We didn't win that, right? That wasn't the victory for us. So the Prophet ﷺ, I wish, maybe one time we can bring a whiteboard. I don't know if we have a whiteboard at the masjid. Yeah, I can draw you some maps as well. So now like I said, the Roman Empire is in the northern Arabian Peninsula. So think today, modern day Palestine, a big part of Jordan, what is today Syria, all the way up into Turkey, and then east into Egypt, into Libya. Effectively, the Mediterranean is a Roman lake. The Mediterranean Ocean today is a Roman lake, right? The Persians are to the east. Incidentally, most of the battles between the Persians and the Romans were won by the Persians. The only reason the Persians weren't able to actually conquer the Romans was because the Romans had a stronger navy. So whenever the Persians would get close enough to the ocean, they'd get defeated by the Romans, right? And that's why those territories were drawn up the way they were. So the Prophet ﷺ now sends another Sariyah to the north. First time it went northwest. So this was Mu'tah. Now it's going northeast. It's slightly east of where Mu'tah is, and it's a little bit closer to Medina. It's 11 to 12 days ride from Medina. So it's a little bit closer to Medina. And the hadith starts off with a narration of Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu. Amr ibn al-As, if you recall, he is still new to Islam. So Khalid ibn al-Walid was new to Islam in Mu'tah. Amr ibn al-As is new to Islam in Dat al-Salasil. And we'll talk a little bit about him today. So he says in his hadith, he says, the Prophet ﷺ commanded me, he sent for me, and he commanded me to wear my clothes and my armor and bring my weaponry and go and meet him in his house. So that's the start of this hadith. And he says, when I got to him, the Prophet ﷺ was making wudu. So I waited until he was done. And then he looked at me, the hadith in Arabic, the easiest translation is, he looked at me up and down. It's almost like, when you're sizing someone up. So the Prophet ﷺ is doing that with who? Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu. And he says to him the following: I wish to appoint you as a leader of the army, and Allah will protect you and give you much ghanima. I am optimistic that you will get much wealth from this particular ghazwa. The Prophet ﷺ says this is Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As. Now, who is Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As? Who is he? He's the son of As ibn Wa'il, okay. He's a diplomat, spokesperson for the Quraysh, yeah. And he comes from Quraysh nobility. So As ibn Wa'il, his father, was the clansman, the tribal chief of a group called the Banu Sahm. So Al-Walid ibn Mughira, the father of Khalid ibn Walid, was the tribal leader of Banu Makhzum, the fighters of the Quraysh. He was the tribal leader of a group of people called the Banu Sahm. And Al-Walid ibn Mughira, we spoke about him a little bit. He's mentioned in the Quran in different ayat, as is Al-As ibn Wa'il, the father of Amr ibn al-As, as is As ibn Wa'il. Where is As ibn Wa'il mentioned? The Mufassirin say that قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ is actually revealed about As ibn Wa'il himself. He went to the Prophet ﷺ early in Mecca. This is the father of Amr ibn al-As. And he said to him, hey, once you stop with your foolish preaching, we don't want to hear anything about your new message. We don't want to hear about this. And he just said, listen, let's just make this work. Let's make this work for both of us. You have a new God? No problem. We have 360. So we'll add one more, 361, no problem. You worship ours part of the year, we'll worship yours part of the year. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no. He's like, how about we worship, a week and you guys, and we'll worship yours? And he's like, no. He says, how about we do a year? And then he's like, no. As ibn Wa'il is going to negotiate with the Prophet ﷺ about the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ then comes down to the Prophet ﷺ in early Mecca. We don't worship what you worship, you don't worship what we worship. You don't understand anything about what we're telling you. It's not a negotiation, right? So this is one of the situations that's mentioned about the father of Amr ibn al-As. The other thing that a lot of Mufassirin say is about the father of Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu is the ayah in Surah Yasin, when amongst the things that the Prophet ﷺ was teaching them was the resurrection of the dead. And Al-As ibn Wa'il goes to a graveyard and pulls out bones of a dead body. And he goes to the Prophet ﷺ, making fun of him, and he crushes the bones. He smashes them to bits, into powder. And he says, are you joking? Are you saying that your God is going to bring these back to life? Are you joking? And like people around him are like, ha, 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 like they're joking around with him. Which ayat come down as an outcome of that? MashaAllah. MashaAllah. Did you hear this? Okay, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Yasin, He says, وَضَرَبَ لَنَا مَثَلًا وَنَسِيَ خَلْقَهُ قَالَ مَنْ يُحْيِي الْعِظَامَ وَهِيَ رَمِيمٌ. In Surah Yasin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and the human being gave us an example, like as a joke. And the human being says, how will you bring these back when these bones are useless? قُلْ يُحْيِيهَا الَّذِي أَنْشَأَهَا أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ وَهُوَ بِكُلِّ خَلْقٍ عَلِيمٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, responds, and He says, the one who brings it back is the one that made it live in the first place. And He is aware of everything that is a living creation. This is the response to the father of Amr ibn al-As. There's a hadith about the Prophet ﷺ where he speaks about the sons of Al-As ibn Wa'il. And it is also narrated that Al-As ibn Wa'il is the one that said, after the death of the young son of the Prophet ﷺ, and he also made fun of him, and he said, Muhammad ﷺ has been cut off. Do you guys know this hadith? He's been cut off, and then which surah comes down? Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar, and at the end it says, Inna shani'aka huwa al-abtar. The one that is ridiculing you, that is saying you're not going to have followers and you're not going to have people listen to you, you're not going to have this, they're the ones that will be cut off. So the Prophet ﷺ comments about this hadith, and he says, Ibn al-As mu'minin. He will be the one that's cut off because both of his boys will be believers. Both of his boys will be believers. So he had two boys. This is the father of Amr ibn al-As. He had two boys. One is called Amr ibn al-As, and the other is called Hisham ibn al-As. Hisham actually accepts Islam in early Mecca. Okay? Hisham accepts Islam in early Mecca. Now, Hisham radiallahu anhu, when he's found out to be a Muslim, what was the policy of the Quraysh nobility? Like, if you were a slave, if you're someone that was unprotected, like Bilal radiallahu anhu or Sumayya radiallahu, if you were from the lowly classes of Mecca, they torture you in public. They bring you in public, they punish you, they'd whip you, they torture you in public to make a scene of it. However, if you were amongst the nobility, what would they do? They torture you in private. So they do the same thing, but they have a little dungeon. So it's like, no, I'm not going to embarrass myself by hitting you in front of your friends. I'm going to take you home and do it myself. You know what I mean? So they had little dungeons, and they beat them up in the dungeons, and that's what they did with Hisham ibn Wa'il. In fact, Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As says, I actually used to participate with my father in beating up my own brother, right, to have them turn from their deen. They wanted to keep the problem local. And then the other thing, so by the way, does anyone know the story of his rescue? The story of the rescue of Hisham ibn al-As? So Hisham ibn al-As was actually kept in a dungeon with one of his friends called Ayyash ibn al-Rabi'ah. And he was another son of a nobility person, and they were friends. They're like, let's beat them up together. Let's keep them in the same dungeon. We'll take turns, right? By the way, does anyone remember a story? Someone else we talked about that was in a similar situation? Abu Jandal, and who else? Who else? Who was the Shaheed in Uhud who came from a very rich family? Who was the first? Me? Mus'ab ibn Umair. His mother locked him up. Remember? His mother locked him up. So all of these stories, this is a recurring story in early Mecca. You get locked up and beat up in the dungeon, right? He was actually rescued through a special forces operation by the brother of Khalid ibn Walid. Before Khalid ibn Walid became Muslim. Al-Walid ibn Walid, he was in Medina. This is after Badr. He goes off on his own. He jumps over the fence. He goes into the dungeon. He breaks the chains, and he takes them both back with him to Medina. And he actually says, Al-Walid ibn Walid, he says, when I took them, they were super skinny, very, very malnutrition. And in the process of getting them rescued, he didn't fight anyone, but he broke one of his fingers. And he actually has a hadith about his finger. He's like, I don't care about my finger so long as it's working fi sabilillah. This is the brother of Khalid ibn Walid, right? So this is Al-As ibn Walid, the father of Amr ibn al-As. Now, Amr ibn al-As himself he was educated. He came from a rich family. He wore all the fancy clothes. He had all the nice cars. He smelled nice. But in addition, he had another advantage, which is he was very well traveled. He traveled north. He traveled south. He actually went to, think about it in those terms, right? He traveled all the way north to Sham, Syria, Damascus, that general area. He went to Jordan. He went to Yemen. He went to Abyssinia multiple times. That's where he developed a relationship with the king of Abyssinia, right? The king of Abyssinia was his close friend. He also traveled to Egypt before he became Muslim. And according to Ibn Ishaq, he went as far as Libya, even beyond Egypt. So he's very well trained. Like, he knows about cultures, and he knows about languages, and he knows about people. He knows about food. So he's very well educated. That's part of the reason why he's such a tremendous diplomat. He can deal with people, right, of different ways. So anyway, there's a lot to say about Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, but his real stardom happens at the time of the Khilafah of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, when, remember, Abu Bakr Siddiq sent essentially two armies, right? And one was Khalid ibn Walid, so we talked about that a little bit. Amr ibn al-As is sent north. He's sent north. And he links up with Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu in southern Palestine, in a city called Ajnadin. And there's a tremendous battle in Ajnadin. Ajnadin happens before Yarmouk. So the order of battle against the Romans, Ajnadin first, major defeat, and then Yarmouk second, wipe out of the entire Roman army, was in Yarmouk. But in Ajnadin, so in Ajnadin, you have a collection of all the superstar Sahaba. So Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid has just come over, and you have Amr ibn al-As, you have Shurahbil, you have Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah was also the leader of the Northern Army, right, as you know. And in Ajnadin, he links up with Khalid ibn Walid, and Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu does amazing things. Like he does reconnaissance of the Romans. He actually captures some of the horses. I don't know if I ever told you this before. In Ajnadin, he captures the horses, and and they butcher the horses, and he knows the power of the horses on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side. Like, this is the level, like today we call it hacking. This is the level of hacking of Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid against what the Romans had. So much so that the Sahaba would call him reckless for doing what he's doing. By the way, another really interesting thing, this is Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu. In the Battle of Ajnadin, this is a famous thing that happened. He drops his helmet. His helmet falls off his head. And Sayyidina Khalid ibn Walid, if you can imagine, he's never known to panic or be afraid. And the Sahaba look at him and he looks like he's panicking because he lost his helmet. And he effectively leaves the battle, and he starts to look for where his helmet fell, to find the helmet. And he finds it and he puts it on and he resumes. And at the end of that particular event, the Sahaba's like, what was that? What are you doing? There's like 50 helmets. You could have taken any of the other helmets. Why did you left the army practically in disarray, and you go to find your helmet? What was his answer? Does anyone know what he says? He has the hair of the Prophet ﷺ, and he didn't want to lose it. This is okay. So Amr ibn al-As, we know afterwards, like, there's Yarmouk, and then there's the surrounding of Bayt al-Maqdis by Sayyidina Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, and then it's liberated by Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab. And then Amr ibn al-As convinces him that where does he want to go next? Egypt. Naturally, right? Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab didn't want him to go there. He's like, no. That's too far. He said, no, just give me a chance. Let me just go. Let me just go try these guys out. Right? And so he goes to Egypt, right? In fact, there's a city in Egypt. He not only does he beat up the Romans, but he actually founds a city. What's the name of the city? Fustat. Fustat. It still exists. Like in old Cairo today, Fustat, we call, the Egyptians call it Masr al-Adima, older Egypt. It's Fustat. It's what Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As founded. The first masjid ever built in Egypt, in Cairo today, is called the Masjid of Amr ibn al-As. Right? The first masjid ever. So this is Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu. So you can imagine with that background, the Prophet ﷺ says you'll get some money. What does he say? He says, I'm not in it for the money. He says, I'm not in it for the money. I accepted Islam for Islam. I accepted Islam fi sabilillah, and I accepted Islam to be with you. I didn't accept Islam to be, to get rich. And then the Prophet ﷺ says something to him that most of us will know. Very famous hadith. Very famous hadith. This is the event where it occurs. So the Prophet ﷺ says to Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, Ni'ma المال الصالح للرجل الصالح. And notice hadith, very famous hadith by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he says to Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As, he says, accept the wealth that you'll be given. And then he follows on and he says, نعم المال الصالح للرجل الصالح. The best of wealth or the best of money is a lot of wealth to a good person. So I'm going to pause on this hadith for a second. This is so important about how we as Muslims understand wealth, right? How we understand wealth. So, نعم المال الصالح للرجل الصالح. He says, يا عمرو نعم المال الصالح للرجل الصالح. How good is pure money for a righteous man? What do you understand by this hadith? This is important. So just pause for a second and understand this hadith before we talk about the Sariya or itself. Okay, righteous person spend the right way. Perfect. It's not a sin to have plenty of money. It's not a sin to have plenty of money. Money is one of these things for us as an ummah is what? It's power, but of course, 100% power. What else? Utility. Okay, you can take care of your family. You don't have to beg. What else? Charity. Charity, great example. The bottom line is the goodness of the wealth that you have depends on how you use it. Just like the goodness of power you have depends on how you use it. You could be a bully, or you could be someone that defends people. One is a good example of using power. One is a bad example of using power. Wealth is the same way. And the reason this is really important to understand is because in many modern day, we pretend like having money is a bad thing, and it's not. It's not. Someone pursuing rizq and wanting to get better at their job or seeking the next promotion or getting skilled up to be able to do that is actually a good thing. That's a thing of benefit. It's a thing of benefit for the ummah. There's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ sees someone begging. And he was like, why are you begging? He says, because I don't have a job. He says, what do you have? He says, I don't know what he had. He had like a carpet and something else. The Prophet ﷺ took them and said, who wants to buy this? And one of the companions bought it. Like things that weren't worth. Prophet ﷺ took the money and bought the man a shovel. And he says, take this shovel and go do work with it. And then he explains it. He says, working and earning your own money and getting rich in your own way, it's better than you begging or becoming, someone that the community has to support. What's better for you? So we have to understand this as an ummah, is that having our own wealth and being able to build it and being able to get better at it is so important for us as an ummah. It's not about, there's no concept in Islam that money is evil and bad to have. The ayah in Surah Al-Kahf about Dhul Qarnayn. وَآتَيْنَاهُ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ سَبَبًا. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say next? فَأَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا. Dhul Qarnayn is a king that ruled the earth east and west. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says فَآتَيْنَاهُ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ سَبَبًا. آتَيْنَاهُ مِنْ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ سَبَبًا. What does that mean? He had science, he had technology, he had an army, he had money, he had resources, he had farming, he had literature, he had life, he had everything. This is Dhul Qarnayn. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what does أَتْبَعَ سَبَبًا mean? He created more of it. He didn't just settle with what he had. He created more. But he created more why? To destroy the earth or take over the earth? No, to spread Islam in the earth. That was the job of Dhul Qarnayn. That's what I meant, alayhi salam. So Imam didn't conquer everything for the sake of conquering everything. He conquered everything for the sake of spreading Islam. Right? So this is a very different mindset. Very different mindset, right? So he says, Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As, يا عمرو نعم المال الصالح للرجل الصالح. نعم المال الصالح للرجل الصالح. Okay, so we talked about this money. Now, the other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ relevant to money is fitnat ummati al-mal. One of the fitnas of my ummah is too much money. One of the fitnas that my ummah will have is too much money. This is now where you look at crazy people that don't know what to do anything better with their wealth, and so they buy a gold-plated Rolls Royce. And we have people in the ummah that do that. It's not, a Rolls Royce is not enough. It has to be made of gold, right? Otherwise, it doesn't stand out, right? And so that's a bad example. That's a bad example of usage of that wealth. So this is fitnat ummati al-mal. Okay. And another hadith, Prophet ﷺ, it is, the believer is not the one who wants to be poor, right? And the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, Allahumma inni as'aluka rizqan wasi'an halalan tayyiba. Ya Allah, I ask you for a lot of rizq that is halal, that is tayyib, that is pure, that is good. So it is a good thing for the ummah to be seeking the wealth for the objectives of using it for good use. Taking care of the family, taking care of the ummah, taking care of the community, building the masjid. These are all great uses of having that. Okay. The other hadith that is also mentioned here in the event of that Salasil is Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As says to him, to the Prophet ﷺ, he says the following. This hadith is narrated twice. He says, when the Prophet ﷺ would look at me, I used to feel like I was the only one there. When he looked at me, when he spoke, by the way, this was the nature of the Prophet ﷺ. This was, one of the characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ. He wasn't, he didn't like we were talking to people like, yeah, we're on our phones. He never did that. The Prophet ﷺ, when someone went to speak to him, he gave him his full undivided attention. He'd move his body towards the person. Like he wouldn't even speak to you like this. He would turn his body and look at you. And Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As says, when the Prophet ﷺ spoke to me, I felt like I was the only one in existence and he loved me the most. He loved me the most. So I asked him, this is another really famous hadith. You know what he asked him? Who do you love the most? Who do you love the most? So he's like, I'm going to test it just to make sure I'm his number one. So Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As says, who do you love the most, Ya Rasulullah? And what did the Prophet ﷺ say? Aisha radiallahu anha. He says, no, I mean from the men. What does he say? Abuha, her father. So, and then he says, who's next? He says, Omar. Who's next? So then he's like, and then I stopped. Because I was not on the list of the top 3 or 4. So like I was worried I wouldn't even show up on the list. I stopped asking him. Right? This is the other hadith relevant to that the Salasa narrated by Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu. Okay. So then Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As leads an army of 300 men, sort of a small contingency compared to Mu'tah. And he's now heading north. And he effectively is going on against, now the Romans have learned a lesson. I keep pointing left and right based on where we are on the map. The Romans have learned a lesson from Mu'tah. So they now have a bigger army in weight with backing up their Arab buddies in the north on the other side. And Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As realizes that the army is massive. They're going to face off against a huge army of the Romans. And it is winter and it is freezing cold. It is really cold. But has anyone ever been cold in the desert? Never been in the desert in the cold? The desert winter is very different to like winter in Seattle. Very different. You know when they say it's cold to the bone, yeah, it's dry cold. It's dry cold. In the same way that dry, if you've ever been in dry heat, if you've been like to, Mecca or whatever, Medina, the Prophet ﷺ has a hadith about Medina. We talked earlier about the blessings of Medina. The Prophet ﷺ has a hadith about Medina. Whoever can take its heat in summer, it's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's cold weather in winter. It's one of the most blessed, patient people. Right? This is about living in Medina, right? So desert cold is very cold. And so the Sahaba radiallahu anhum would say, Amr ibn al-As, oh, by the way, pause for a second. If you were a Sahabi in one of those 300 men, how would you feel about the leader? What's in a human sense? He's new. Okay. Why did you pick him? Like a interesting decision. Okay. What else? Sorry? So very good point. Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu fought personally in Badr and Uhud. Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu only participated in Uhud and then Khandaq. Amr ibn al-As showed up for everyone. Okay, so now you've got the start of the string. Pull a little bit more on that idea. Put a little bit more. We talked about his father. His father's tremendous hatred for Islam. Amr radiallahu anhu inherited a lot of that from the father. He inherited a lot of that. As ibn Wa'il already died. He perished a long time ago in Badr, right? But Amr ibn al-As had that animosity. He had, in Jahiliyyah days, the hatred of Islam and the hatred of the Prophet ﷺ. By the way, the hatred of Amr radiallahu anhu was very different to the enmity of Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu. Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu was he was never really, what would you call it? What's the word I'm looking for? He was never really religious about it in that sense. Like he didn't have a I'm a right wing, left wing. Like that wasn't. It's like, listen, whenever there's a battle, tell me and I'll show up and I'll help you finish it, right? Like I'll help you finish the job. But he didn't really have a lot of religion around it. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't really care what these guys say. Amr ibn al-As cared. He cared. And remember, he argued against the Muslims where? In Najashi. The second Hijrah, he's the one that was sent to Najashi. And by the way, the Najashi, should, just to give you even more insight on that, because I know we talked about that extensively, just to shed even more light on it. The situation with Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As and Najashi, on the other side of the Muslims, who was there? Ja'far was the one that was the lawyer for the Muslims, but who else was in the clan of Ja'far? His own brother. His own brother, Hisham ibn al-As, had escaped to Abyssinia in the second Hijrah. Not the first one, the second Hijrah to Abyssinia, the brother of al-As was there. And so one of the things that he says to him, he says, they're just a bunch of young kids, O king. This is just a misunderstanding. This is just an internal dispute. They're a bunch of political rebels. We just want them back. We'll take care of them when we go back to Mecca. Don't you worry. We don't want them to cause any problems for you. This was part of Amr ibn al-As did. So there's potential and a little bit of animosity, right? With the fact that he's a leader, he's going forward, right? But they tell him, we're going to light fires because we're cold. And he says, absolutely not. In fact, he takes it a step further. What does he say? He says, if whoever lights a fire, I'll throw him in it. By the way, the Sahaba take that, they go back and they complain to the Prophet ﷺ, right, about what Amr ibn al-As did. And when they go back and they complain, and the Prophet ﷺ asks them, he's like, why didn't you let them light a fire? He says to them, because I realized after we did some reconnaissance how small we were compared to the massive army that we're facing off against. And I didn't want the Romans and the Arabs to find out how little of a number we had. It would have just encouraged them to attack. So that was his logic, right? And the Prophet ﷺ actually agreed with it, right? So this is what happened. So when Amr goes up and he does the reconnaissance, he's like, we don't have enough people. We don't have enough people to go and fight the battle that the Prophet ﷺ taught us to. By the way, it's called that Salasil. Oh, sorry, this one's called Sarit al-Salasil because there's a river by that city called Salsal, right? It has nothing to do with chains. So the Prophet ﷺ sends him back up. And the backup is comprised of Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, Abu Bakr, Siddiq, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he makes, the Prophet ﷺ makes the Amir of the backup Abu Ubaidah. Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu was a much more senior leader, much more senior in Islam. He's a real alim of Islam. And he's catching up with who? Amr ibn al-As radiallahu. And they show up, the two armies show up. Oh, and the Prophet ﷺ sends him, and he says to him, don't disagree with Amr ibn al-As about the course of action. Like you're the leader of the backup, he's the leader of the army. When you guys go, work it out amongst each other. I don't want disagreements between you. It shows you the importance of the lack of disagreement and the unity, right? So when they show up, the Muslims are about to pray. They're about to perform their prayer. And Abu Ubaidah steps in. And he's like, I'm going to lead the prayer. Amr al-As says, absolutely not. I'm leading the prayer. You came as my backup. You didn't come as the leader. I'm the leader of the army. You're my backup, right? And there's a little bit of tension there. And then Sayyidina Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah radiallahu anhu, he gives it up for Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As. And if you read the commentary of the scholars, it's beautiful. Like it just says, look at the maturity of Sayyidina Abu Ubaidah. He doesn't argue about it. He doesn't he's like, how much Quran do you know? I know Al-Baqarah and Imran. What do you like? He doesn't do any of that. You understand? He doesn't do any of that. He's just like, you go ahead. In the interest of the unity of you, right? So we take a lesson from that, subhanAllah. So Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu steps down, so one of the lessons we take from this, by the way, is that obviously the humanity of the Sahaba, we talked about that a lot, role models and how they resolve tension between them. But the other thing that's important is who is going to be more qualified at the end. The qualification is a very important thing in Islam, right? So there's a chapter in fiqh about this called Imamat al-Mafdul ala al-Fadil. Has anyone heard of that? The imama of the one that is less qualified on the one that is more qualified. In other words, it is permissible for the imam. And imam, by the way, here doesn't just mean leader of the prayer, right? But the imam, the leadership, is based on the qualification. I was going to say something and I just forgot. Important thing to talk about imam for a second. When we think in nowadays, modern day Muslims, we go, oh, imam, yeah, he's the guy that reads the Fatiha and Allah Ahad when they come to pray. But imam had a much bigger meaning at the time of the companions of Allah, right? So I want you to just think of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, or what job did the imam have? He was the ruler. He was the ruler of the country. So that's an important part. He was the president, so to speak. But he's the one that led the prayers in the main masjid, and he's the one that gave the khutbah in the main masjid. The imam wasn't just the ruler. He wasn't just the president. He led the prayers and he led the khutbah. Can you imagine nowadays, like some of the people, like that was the job of the imam. That was the job of the imam, right? It was a very serious job. Okay. So basically, the Muslims show up with the contingency of 400 or 500 men, and this tribe of Qudaa takes off. Like the Muslims just basically show up, and they all run away. Like there's no battle, there's no fight that ever actually happens. And the Sahaba radiallahu anhum take a lot of ghanimah. So they're taken by complete surprise. They take off and they leave the village, and they leave behind all their stuff. Companions radiallahu anhum take all their stuff, and they come back to Medina. So it's a major financial win for the Muslims, right? No battle actually ever occurs. Okay. Another event that occurs here is another event that occurs here is when on the way back from Dhat al-Salasil, Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As recounts this, and he says, I woke up and I was in a state of janaba. I woke up and I was in a state of janaba, right? So in other words, he has to shower before he leads the prayer. So he basically just says, it was too cold, and I decided to make tayammum. Remember, it's freezing cold in the desert. He's like, I decided to make tayammum. And the Sahaba behind him are furious with him. And they're like, we have water. He's like, I'm not doing wudu. It's too cold. and he makes tayammum, and he insists on leading the prayer, and he leads the prayer. And they go back and they complain to the Prophet ﷺ. Like, can you imagine the list of things they had when they go back? Like, he did this, he did this, he did this. And so the Prophet ﷺ calls him. Like, look at the Prophet ﷺ. He verifies, right? And he says, Ya Amr, asallayta bihim wa antum junub? He said, did you pray with them when you were in a state of janaba? And Sayyidina Amr ibn al-As says to them, he says, Ya Rasulullah, I heard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, he says in the hadith, Sami'atu Allah. He says, I heard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, right? And he says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, la taqtulu anfusakum, inna Allah kana bikum rahima. He says, I heard Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in the Quran, oh, you who believe, do not kill yourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is merciful with you. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam smiled and he let him go. He smiled, right? And there's so many, like if you read the books of books of hadith, books of tafsir, there's so many things you learn just from this event. Just from this event, right? Which is what? Like, let me just go through some of those. So first of all, tayammum can take the place of ghusl and not just wudu. That's one lesson the fuqaha take, right? The second thing is you're allowed to perform tayammum even if the water is present for some legit reasons, right? And the legit reasons that the ulama have said is like it's freezing cold, or you have some kind of skin disease or whatever. You're not allowed. So you're permitted to make tayammum. The other really fascinating thing here is that again, now here's a companion that's fairly new to Islam. He decides to make ijtihad based on what he knows to be true, even when the Prophet ﷺ is there. Right? Even when the Prophet ﷺ is there, right? So the Sahaba radiallahu anhum derived laws through their own reasoning, even at the time, and this is where we get ijtihad from. And then the other point, one who does tayammum isn't diminished in status to lead the prayer. There's not, oh no, you have tayammum, you stand in the back. Right? There's no such thing. You can have tayammum and you can still be the imam, right? Ijtihad takes into account the natural worldly situations, right? When a natural worldly situation. Okay. Where's the ayah in the Quran that talks about janaba? Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah number 6. Right? Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah number 6. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, idha qumtum ila as-salah. إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم. This is the ayah that, like, ignorant Muslims say, oh, why do we have to make wudu? It's right here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you get up to prayer, then wash your faces, right? وأيديكم, and then wash your hands إلى المرافق, up until the extremities. وامسحوا برؤوسكم, and then wash your hair, cover your hair with water. وأرجلكم, and wash your feet إلى الكعبين, right? And this is in the Quran. Look at the level of detail in the Quran. وإن كنتم جنبا فطهروا, and if you're in a state of janaba, then you have to purify yourselves. وإن كنتم مرضى. SubhanAllah, this shows you the sophistication of this deen. Sophistication, because like you'll stand in front of Islamophobes or idiots or ignorant. What about if you're fasting? What about if you're sick? What about if you have to take medication? We have answers for all the above. Wallahi, we have answers for all the above in our deen, subhanAllah. And if you are sick, أو على سفر, or you're traveling, أو جاء أحد منكم الغائط, or one of you has been, to the bathroom, أو لمستم النساء, or you've touched women, فلم تجدوا ماء, so if you don't find water, فتيمموا صعيدا طيبا, then you're permitted to make tayammum. فامسحوا بوجوهكم وأيديكم منه, فامسحوا بوجوهكم وأيديكم منه. So then, touch your faces and your hands from the ground. ما يريد الله ليجعل عليكم من حرج. Allah doesn't want to make things difficult for you. ولكن يريد ليطهركم وليتم نعمته عليكم لعلكم تشكرون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want to make difficulty for you, but He intends to purify you and complete His favor upon you, that you may be grateful. Right? This is the ayah in the Quran that speaks about wudu and tayammum, relevant to this particular event. Okay, good. Let's see. Okay, after this particular event, we'll just cover one other thing and then we'll wrap up, inshallah. After this particular event, so we talked about Mu'tah, and then we talked about that Salasil. There was never a threat from the northern Arabs at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Never ever a threat. Like, they were done. They're like, we're not gonna mess around with these guys. The message is, don't mess with the Muslims, right? So we're not gonna mess with them. Okay. The other event that happens here, it's also mentioned in the Quran, is a small expedition was sent by the Prophet ﷺ, and it passes by a tribe, and the tribe has someone in it called Amir ibn al-Adba al-Ajja'i. Does anyone know the story? It says in the Quran. And this Amir actually lives amongst the kuffar, but he's a secret Muslim. And he meets the army and he says, Assalamu alaikum. Amir says to the army, Assalamu alaikum. Small expedition, Assalamu alaikum. One of the people of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, he had beef with Amir, with this particular guy from the time of Jahiliyyah. And his name is Muhlim. And he said to him, and when he says, now in those days, if someone says Assalamu alaikum, just like nowadays, what does it mean? If you see a brother at the airport and they say Assalamu alaikum, you've never seen him in your life, what does it mean? They're a Muslim. Very easy, right? Very easy. Okay. So they had the same thing. If you were not a Muslim, you would not say Assalamu alaikum. They had the exact same thing. So he says, I don't accept his Islam. I've known him from before. I don't trust this guy. I don't accept his Islam. And he killed him. And he took away his things. So he treated him like an enemy combatant, so to speak. And he killed him and he took away his things. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals an ayah in Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 94 in Surah An-Nisa. So he's very reprimanded, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals an ayah just about this event. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu idha darabtum fi sabilillah. O you who believe, if you go to forth fi sabilillah, in the cause of Allah, فتبينوا, then investigate. ولا تقولوا لمن ألقى إليكم السلام لست مؤمنا. And do not say to the one who gives you a greeting of peace, meaning Assalamu alaikum, you are not a believer. Don't say to them, you are not a believer. لست مؤمنا. تبتغون عرض الدنيا فعند الله مغانم كثيرة. All you are looking for is the worldly life, aspiring for worldly life. For Allah, with Allah, there are many acquisitions, meaning you'll get other things from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. كذلك كنتم من قبل فمن الله عليكم فتبينوا إن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. And for with Allah there are many acquisitions. You yourselves were like that before, meaning in Jahiliyyah times. Then Allah conferred His favor upon you. So investigate. Indeed, Allah is ever with you and acquainted with everything you do. So the tribe that had Amir, the group of Muslims with Amir, the one that was just killed, go to the Prophet ﷺ and they demand for this matter to be resolved. And the Prophet ﷺ pays them 100 camels on behalf of Amir. This is now a case of wrongful death. Wrongful death, right? Ibn Ishaq narrates something amazing that happens to the companion that killed Amr radiallahu anhu. He says that shortly after that, he passes away. The one that killed Amr dies. And they go to the Prophet ﷺ. Prophet ﷺ refuses to make dua for him, for the one that killed, right? Because now it's evident that, ultimately that particular event was for money, right? Was for money. And Ibn Ishaq says it's narrated that they buried this companion, radiallahu anhum, and the next day they found him above his grave, face down. And they bury him again, and he shows up again, and they bury him, and then he shows up again, and then they take him to a valley where they have to cover him up with rocks. They have to cover him up with rocks, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, when he sees this, he remarks, he says the following hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. He says, verily the earth took people even much worse than he was. Much worse than he was, right? And he says, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching you a lesson to show you the sanctity of life amongst each other. To show you the sanctity of life, the importance of protecting each other's lives and not to behave right in that manner. So this is another event that occurs after that is Salasim. So we're at the end of tonight. Just to give you an idea, we could start with Fath Makkah, but I'm not going to. The major events between now and Ramadan, inshallah, I hope to complete it by then. Next 4 or 5 times will all be about Fath Makkah. Like Fath Makkah will probably take us up to Ramadan, right? And then we'll resume, inshallah, after Ramadan. Like Fath Makkah is going to take a while, right? So I think we shouldn't start it tonight. There's a little lecture on Arab tribes first, and we won't do that before we get into Fath Makkah. So, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim. Allahumma barik ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim. في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم اغفر للمسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء والأموات إنك سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم نسألك رضاك والجنة ونعوذ بك من سخطك والنار. اللهم إنك عفو كريم تحب العفو فاعف عنا. اللهم انصر الإسلام وأعز المسلمين واعلو برحمتك كلمة الحق والدين. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خير, and I will see you next week inshallah. What's here, is the masjid going to have a celebration for Gaza or what? Like MAPS today had a big party. By the way, there's another thing going on, so I have to tell you all. Yesterday there was an event. I attended it by accident, just in full disclosure. They had a fundraiser event. Does anyone know about the UW sponsorship of students thing? So yesterday they were collecting money for the students to come over here. So UW said that if they stopped the protests last week, the students can come, but they wouldn't take care of their expenses. So yesterday they were collecting money for the expenses of the students. So there's brothers and sisters. I don't know their names. Sarah, I'm sure if you check on someone with maps, they can tell you. So whatever you can give, they're just to take care of like 10, 20 students. They said they'll cover their education, but we have to cover their food and accommodation. So.